everyone, and welcome to the Lens Deconstructed podcast. This is a podcast where we come together to discuss the Bible and explore the lens of the ancient authors. My name is Daniel Owen, and I'm a journalist.
My name is Brent Eisen. I am a truck driver and also a Bible nerd.
We're just two average guys with a serious interest in the Bible and a whole lot of questions. Each week, we will examine passages and topics and try to deconstruct the lenses we often use to understand them.
We want to be an information hub for those of us who want to learn more about the Bible from the perspective of ancient Israel and first century Judea, or to discuss the language, history, culture, geography, and spiritual worldviews found in the Bible.
Lastly, at the Lens Deconstructed, we neither have all the answers, nor do we want you to make our theology your own. Instead, we are here to empower you with the tools and context to better understand who God is and what exactly He expects from each of us.
So if you are interested in joining us on our journey, we would like to welcome you to the Lens Deconstructed. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Lens Deconstructed podcast with myself, Brent Eisen, and my good friend Daniel Owens over there in Romania. We're actually going to strive our best. I don't know if we'll get there today due to some technical issues we had earlier, but we are going to strive to actually make it through our Passover discussion today, or Pesach, which if you listen to our last episode, might be better understood as to stand guard over, or just stand over and protect. That was a really interesting thing. I learned a lot from that one. I'm sure you guys did as well. But so we're going to touch on a lot of different things today about how Christ, how Jesus, Yeshua, our Messiah, actually completed this Passover festival, how he partook of it, how he was the lamb that was sacrificed. It creates a lot of questions whenever you're thinking about it. We all know that he was the Passover lamb, but the question is how. And how literal can we take that? We're going to get into some calendar stuff today. So we're going to be having a throwback episode towards Dr. Michael Heiser, who loved to get into the calendar issues. My good friend Daniel is going to break it down. He's got a really good calendar that he actually made up. So let's dive into today's episode. Daniel, how are you doing?
Oh, man. Good. So what they don't know is that we've been talking for, half an hour about all this. And yeah, good. Things are good. Just trying to, get through all this. There's a lot of material. Like we mentioned last week, this is something that you could literally talk about. I mean, I don't know how you could put a cap on it and say, all right, we figured it out. We know that Yeshua is the Passover lamb. And if you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, we'll start reading real quickly in verse 6. And this is Paul. He's talking to the believers in Corinth, saying, "Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that even a little chametz, which is leaven, how it leavens the whole lump, meaning that it spreads to the whole batch of dough? Therefore, cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump or a new batch of dough, as you really are matzah, or unleavened bread. For Yeshua, or the Messiah, or Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice or evil, but with the unleavened bread, or matzah, of sincerity and emet, or truth." So we see that he is our Passover lamb. But the question is, a question a lot of folks inevitably have is, how does this all work? Like, when did this happen? How did it happen? People tend to want to see a timeline of how does this make sense? And that's perfect. That is really good, because when you want to read your Bibles, this is a common problem that comes up. How do you understand things that happen when it feels as if there's like inconsistencies with timelines? Now, a lot of that is solved when you understand the way that the Hebrew culture existed with their use of how they told time. So I'm going to post this for everyone who's interested. But I have a short, very brief paper that I put together, and I want to read from that so we can get a grasp as to what we're looking at. And so we need to understand the timeline from the beginning. If you look at your Bibles in Genesis chapter 1, verses 3 through 5, one of the things I note here is that the important Hebrew words, I'm going to give you the Hebrew and I'll give you the English. And so this might be slightly different than what you've heard before, but if you read, if you have a Hebrew Bible, or if you have your English Bible that you can look at your concordance, you'll be able to follow along. So in verse 3 of Genesis chapter 1, it says, Elohim, or God, said, there shall be or light, and there was or. And Elohim saw that it was tov. We've talked about this word in previous podcast episodes. Tov means good. And Elohim divided between the or and the chosek. Chosek means darkness. So he divides between the light and between the darkness. And Elohim proclaimed or yom. So he declares the light to be yom, day. And the chosek, or the darkness, he proclaimed to be leyale, which is night. And there was erev, evening, and boker, morning, yom echad, day one. Now, why did I read that? In order to understand the timeline of the Pesach story found in the Gospels, and the difference. First, I want to put this out there. Pesach, right, is a feast. It is a sacrifice. The Pesach lamb, the Paschal or Pesach lamb, is a lamb who was sacrificed, whose blood was put on the doorpost. Yes, that lamb is eaten, but the idea of Pesach being a festival, there is a meal that follows the sacrifice of that lamb. But this time period it's called Hag HaMatzot. It is literally, the Hag means feast of matzot, unleavened bread. We get matzah. So what you really should be thinking of, this whole time period, there's 7 days here, is the feast of unleavened bread. It begins with the Paschal lamb, or the Pesach lamb's sacrifice, followed by a meal, and then but this whole time there's these 7 days of eating only matzah. You cannot eat any leavened bread. So we have to start there with explaining. People think Passover as an event, as Passover is the feast day. It is not a feast day. It is the Pesach lamb sacrifice. So next, we need to understand a few points about the Jewish way, or the ancient Hebraic way of reckoning time. In our way of thinking, time begins at midnight, so 12 o'clock a.m., and it goes until 11:59 and 59 seconds. 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds later. That is the length of a day. If you ever thought a day was 24 hours, you're off by a second, right? So that is the length of our day, and that's the way we reckon the day. It begins at midnight. The Jewish reckoning of a day, it begins at sundown, so it comes before. And this can be quite dramatic, right? So, and the reason being was the passage we read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 through 5. It says, and there was evening and there was morning. This is day one. So in the Jewish reckoning, they start with evening and they go through the next day. So if you want to know how Christ would have, how he would have considered days and time, when the sun is setting, and I'll put a calendar up for you guys to look at this. When the sun sets, that's the evening of one day. The sun goes down. So now the sun goes behind the horizon. It is now immediately a new day. So as a photographer, we call that blue hour, the moment the sun goes down behind the horizon. From that very moment onward, this is a brand new day. Now, if the sun sets at, say, 6 p.m., so 6:01, the sun is gone. You are now in a completely new day, even though in our reckoning, in sort of Western modern thinking, we still have like 6 hours left in the day. When you realize that a lot of things will look much different when you're looking at your Passover story that's happening in the New Testament. So let's move on a little bit here.
So
Go ahead.
one thing before you go any further,
Sure.
one thing I always like to point out with this differences and when you start your day,
Mhm.
something that Pastor always says, Rick Struckel, he always says that if you think about the way that the Hebrews actually told time, they're also telling a story with it. If you look at it starting in darkness, pretty much at the sundown, right? You start in darkness and you end in light. So
Amen.
illustrating that you start just like God did with creation, there was chaos and then he brought peace. There's this constant renewing. There's this constant
Yep.
joy in the morning, I guess you could say.
Absolutely. Well, you have darkness and chaos, and then God brings newness and life, and then you have the day come. So absolutely, this is the reason why they do it this way, and it just takes the modern Western mind some time to adjust to that way of thinking, because you'll read things like in the evening they did this, and what you don't realize is that's a new day for them. So when we think about that, that's the end of the day for us. It's so we have to make some adjustments as we read, and things will make a whole lot more sense. So let's get back here. There's a few other things that are important to remember. So furthermore, for an accurate understanding of the events in the biblical texts, we need to get a grasp on the ancient understanding of what is the Sabbath. The Sabbath, of course, is the seventh and final day in the biblical counting of a week. Right, so God created the universe. God created all things, and on the seventh day He rested. And this day was Shabbat or Sabbath. Some will call it Shabbos. So they don't have a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday thinking. They don't think that way. You have day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, Shabbat. So when we discuss what we're getting into, you have to take off the lens of Monday to Sunday. You have to take the lens of midnight to midnight off. You have to take those lenses off, and you have to start thinking the way the authors were thinking. Otherwise, it's going to be super confusing. So let's move on here. Therefore, when an ancient Israelite or first century Jew refers to the first day of the week, they specifically mean the day that we would call Sunday. Again, of course, the time that it begins is different, right? So if it's Sabbath begins at Friday evening. At the moment the sun has set on Friday evening, it is now Shabbat. So day 6 is coming to a close. The sun sets on day 6. As soon as that sun goes down past the horizon, boom, it is now Shabbat, it is now Sabbath, day 7. That will last all the way until the following day when the sun sets. When the sun sets on Shabbat or Sabbath, it is now the first day of the week, right? So this is going to be very important whenever we read our stories. Now, does that matter at all? Well, the first day of the week for the Jew, for the ancient Israelite, for the first century Judean, the first day of the week begins when we still consider it Saturday evening. We'd say, well, it's Saturday evening or Saturday night. For them, it's already the first day of the week. So this is also very important to keep in mind. Last thing I want to mention briefly is that there are things that you'll find this in Leviticus 23. There's a few passages about what are called these special Sabbaths. It's a Sabbath that's really important because it falls on or adjacent to a special, like a feast day. And in the case of Pesach, in what's called Hag Hamatzot, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you're gonna have Sabbaths. This is a 7-day festival. So those Sabbaths are special, right? There's something unique about them. They're special because of how they fall on that. So if you look at the calendar here, I'll zoom in as we go through this. We see that the Sabbath here, this is the month of Aviv, right? At the very top of the page, you're going to see some circles with different colors. So these represent the blue to the fading to black represents it's now evening, sun has already set. This is the beginning of the day. The circle that's all black is the middle of the night with midnight highlighted for us for reference. The dark blue fading into yellow is where we're talking about, morning into like dawn. Midday is represented with yellow, and then sunset is represented at the end of the day with yellow fading into like a deep orange. These days begin after the sun sets and they go until sunset. Right? So that is the reckoning of the Jewish day. Now, we know that a few things happened based off of the Gospels, right? So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We know there's some discussion about, so many days before the Passover this happened, so many days before the Passover that happened. And we know we can kind of find ourselves within the text where things fell on these months, on this particular year. So what I want to focus on first is on the Aviv 4, we have the death of Lazarus. We know that he had been dead for 4 days when he was raised by Jesus. And so where I put that here is on Aviv 8, on the Sabbath. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and this is considered what they call the Great Sabbath, because biblically speaking, the Sabbath that from the Old Testament, the Sabbath that preceded the Passover was considered a special Great Sabbath. What's interesting to note here is if you read about the resurrection of Lazarus, raising him from the dead, you hear about these men. They run and tell the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They tell them what Jesus did, and the question would be, why would they run and tell them? It's because he healed again on the Sabbath, and they were thinking that this wasn't allowed, even though of course it was. We know that right after that, Aviv 9, he has the triumphant entry described in John 12, followed by Aviv 10, right? The 10th of Aviv. If you go back to your Exodus story in Exodus 12 verse 3, this is when they would select the lambs. So they're required to go through and make a selection of the lambs, and that is an inspection process. It has to be a pure and spotless lamb, without blemish or without defect. And there's several verses that explain what this process looks like, but they're inspected by a group of people. That's their job, is to go through and make sure that this lamb is actually without defect. You're not taking anybody's word for it. And so what do we see start happening on Aviv 10 in the story during the Gospels, is that this is when he is really being tested by the Torah teachers, by the Pharisees, by the high priests and the whole priesthood system. He's being put to the test. They're poking and prodding to make sure who he is, who he says he is. There's this is, if you read the Gospel of John, he spends chapters talking about this whole section. And we move on to Aviv 11. You'll find those in Mark 14 and Matthew 26, as you can see on that calendar. And then it's pretty quiet. Then you've got Aviv 14. Now, what we have to understand here is that according to Exodus chapter 12, verse 18, well, let's read that real quick. I want to read Exodus chapter 12, verse 18. Now I'm reading this in the English Standard Version. Read it in any version you want. It says, in the first month, so this is the month of Aviv. You might hear Nisan. Nisan, just to clarify for anybody who's not sure what that's all about. Daniel's over there saying it's Aviv or Aviv, and then I hear other people call it Nisan. Nisan was, so first of all, the month of Aviv, and was a time period that God gave that sort of Aviv just means like the barley, right? It's the ripening of the barley. So this is a particular time of year when this would take place. That barley would ripen, and then they could go out there and harvest it. And this is how you would start counting the month of Aviv. When the Jews or the Israelites were exiled in, the 6th century BC, so before Christ, they were exiled in the 6th century to Babylon. During that time, remember why they were exiled. They were exiled because they had they had not been faithful to God, so they were worshiping other gods. There's a lot of stuff going on, and we'll get into that maybe another time. And because of that, there was a lot of there were a lot of issues regarding their keeping of Torah. And when they went to Babylon, it was sort of like the wake up call, the come to Jesus moment. No pun intended. It was this this moment where they realized, oh no, we're exiled. This is not good. This is not what we wanted. And I think everyone collectively had this realization that we had better fix this. And so you have this dramatic turnaround that's happening within the years of exile in Babylon, where they start teaching their kids. They start becoming quite, not everyone, but for the most part, you see this devotion return. However, because they were in Babylon, Babylon was speaking a language called Aramaic. Aramaic is sort of like it's a Semitic language like Hebrew, so it's different, but they have some commonalities. And in the Aramaic or the Babylonian reckoning of months, they have what's called the month of Nisan, which is where, again, they borrowed it from someone else, which was their first month of the year. It sort of corresponded in a lot of ways to Aviv, so that name has stuck. If you want to know the biblical name from God, it's Aviv. The borrowed name from Babylon is Nisan. In the book of Esther, you see the word Nisan used. Why? Because they're in exile. So is it wrong to use Nisan? You can use it. I use Aviv because that's the one that God gave. So back to Exodus 12, verse 18. It says, in the first month, so Aviv, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 1st or the 21st day of the month at evening. So what does that mean? Starting on the month of Aviv, the 14th day, at evening time. Well, what does that mean at the end of the day, right? We just discussed this, right? So if you look at your calendar, the sun sets on the 13th of Aviv. The sun goes down. The moment that sun is down, it is now, boom, the 14th of Aviv, or Nisan. And it is what time? This is supper time. This is time to eat dinner, right? The sun has just set. Everybody's at their house. Supper is beginning, but it's the 14th of Aviv. So they can't eat anything other than matzah. You're not allowed to eat you're not allowed to eat regular bread. It has to be matzah. Your house has to have been free of leaven because this is now the 14th of Aviv or Nisan.
Yeah, no, talking about that, talking about removing the leaven out of your home.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually made aware of this a few years ago. So they would actually go through, right, with a little broom and kind of dustpan thing. The father of the house would actually lead the children with a candle around. They would lead them around the house, and they would actually find all the leaven. Well, first of all, they would hide some leaven throughout the house, right, to illustrate what they're doing.
This is a rabbinic thing.
All the
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And so that's what's so interesting about this is something that the rabbis actually instituted and had the people perform.
Mm-hmm.
And we can actually see it pointing to Yeshua, but I'll get to that in just a second at the end of it. But they would remove all the leaven out of their house, right? You had to get in every nook, every cranny, everything that you could find. Everywhere was hidden. You'd lead the children. The father of the house would lead the children with a little candle around, a little light, right? You'd shine the light in the dark places, and you'd actually remove that leaven, which the Bible always equates to sin. Think of Paul. A little leaven leavens the whole loaf, right? I think you actually read that passage earlier, or back whenever me and you were talking before the episode. And so if you think about this, right, and in aspects of our life, and Yeshua being the light of the world, and you look at our lives, right, as we come to Yeshua, a great light, and he actually lights up all the sin in our lives, and we're actually called to do that now, to actually find all that leaven within us so that we can become a new lump, right, without leaven, unleavened bread. But that's the exact festival that they're celebrating right here.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is that, so the rabbinical system, they do their own thing sometimes. Sometimes it's great, sometimes I wouldn't. But what they do here is fascinating because there's a part of the tradition where they'll go hide some leaven so they can come out and say, see, we found the last bit. We placed it there. It's What God was literally saying is, no, sweep it out, get it out, like have none of it in you. But what's interesting is that matzah is called the bread of, the bread of affliction. And so why are we supposed to eat this? And we see Paul, he comes up with a conclusion that he's associating leaven with sin. Now, this isn't something that you're going to find in the Old Testament. Why is he coming to this conclusion? Well, because the leaven that was supposed to be swept out of their house was to remind them that when you're eating matzah, this is like the bread of affliction. This is the bread that you eat to remember what slavery feels like. Why is Paul thinking sin when he's thinking about the Old Testament passages about the bread of affliction, the bread of slavery? Well, why were you enslaved? Why were we enslaved? We were living under the gods of Egypt. We were living under the oppression of the Pharaoh. And God came down and redeemed us out of that. And he's telling you, this foreshadowing of what happened in Egypt is really telling you the story of God's deliverance of his people, of anyone who would go from slavery in Egypt or slavery in sin, slavery to death, slavery to the gods of this world, slavery to that which death, right? Death, I think is fair. And what causes death? Sin, right? It is that transgression of God's commands. That's what brings death. So he's making these connections. Even though it never says that, he's bringing those connections in there to help you realize, oh, that's what God's meaning. That's really what he's saying. Why is redemption from death equated to sin in the mind of Paul? Because Paul's a genius. Because Paul's putting those things together. So, I say that because I've heard arguments from say non-messianic folks who are like, no, it has nothing to do with sin. It's all about the bread of affliction. That's what the bread of affliction was. That's what slavery was. You had belonged to Egypt in its gods. Now you belong to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. He redeemed you out of their way of doing things, which was leading to death. So I think Paul's 100% tracking right on the message that God is intending for us to be thinking about, like what you said there, that leaven it's transgression, right? That's what that leaven is supposed to be visualized as. Get it out of my life. I don't want it in my house, right?
And Yeshua, the light, makes it so much easier to see that darkness.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so let's go back briefly. I want to go back to our calendar here on the 14th of Aviv. So let me what's up. Okay. The 14th of Aviv, we've got look at real quick, actually, let's look at the 13th of Aviv. This ends at sunset, right? So if you look at your Aviv 13, the sun sets, it is now Aviv 14. Now, there has been no Passover lambs killed up to this point. Hasn't happened yet. That happens before twilight, so before sunset on Aviv 14. Right? So follow with me. The day begins after the sun has set. It will go through the evening, through the night, into the next day, and before the subsequent sunset, that will be when the sacrifice of the Passover lambs happens. So, when the sun has set, right in this evening and at the beginning of Aviv 14, we see at this particular time, Yeshua, Jesus, is sitting down with his disciples. It's already evening time. And what is he doing? He's celebrating the Pesach meal. Now, a lot of people say, well, how could he be eating the Passover lamb if he is the Passover lamb? How could he be eating? Well, first of all, he doesn't eat Passover lamb. He eats no lamb whatsoever. It's not mentioned in there. He doesn't eat it. What does he eat? Matzah. Well, because this is Hag HaMatzot. This is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He's not allowed to eat any leavened bread. So what is he sitting down eating? He is not describing himself at this particular moment as the lamb to them. He's describing himself as this bread is my body. This unleavened bread that's pierced for you is my body. It's broken for you. He's describing himself as he's describing himself as the matzah, the unleavened bread. Right? And so what we miss so often, because we're fixating on something that is very important. We'll talk about, which is the Pesach lamb, absolutely. But he's also the bread of the life, right? He was born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem. Lechem means bread. He's Bet means house. He's from the house. He was born in the house of bread. He is the bread of life. He's constantly referring to himself as such, and he's saying here, "I'm the matzah. I'm the bread without leaven." It's now, if you look at matzah, it's pierced, right? It's first it's crushed, then it's pierced, it's baked out in the sun, and then it's broken. And that's what he's literally saying. He's saying that this is my body, it is broken for you. There's no lamb eaten. So then what happens? We know following this, right? So we're still in a V14. Pull this up here. So we're a V14. I have it little on the side here. It says a V14 continued. What we find is over the next, so through the night, so sunsets, it is now a V14. It's a new day. The new day begins with a dinner. This dinner we call the Last Supper. This is a meal where he eats the matzah with his disciples. He describes himself as being the matzah, right? And then what happens? They go to the whole thing happens. Judas leaves. They go to Gethsemane. There's the prayer. We see that in John 17. So I've got all these verses for you. So over the next several hours, up until the following day at his death, we see Matthew 26 verses 17 through 61, Mark 14 verses 12 through 72, and then Mark 15 verses 1 through 47. Luke 22, and then Luke 23, 1 through 55, and then John 13, chapters 13 through chapter 19. All those events happen on the day of Aviv 14. All of it happens. When does Yeshua exactly die? He is on the cross giving his last breath at the hour when they're sacrificing the Passover lambs on Aviv 14, right before twilight. That's when they sacrifice the lambs. That's when he's dying. So why didn't Jesus eat Passover lamb? Because he was the Passover lamb. What did he eat? Well, he ate the Chag HaMatzot. He ate the matzah. He was celebrating the feast of unleavened bread. He is the bread of life, who came to take away the sins of the world, right? And so he's celebrating matzah, and he is the Pesach.
Yeah, this is something that helped me so much too. Whenever me and you were briefly discussing this, this is a question that I had, because I always knew that he was the Passover lamb, but then you see what we call the Last Supper, what a lot of people call the Last Supper with him and his disciples. And I guess I just always assumed, well, that's the Passover meal, which
because he says,
illustrating that
I want to eat the Passover meal, right? He says that. But here's what people have to realize. He was eating a meal on Pesach. He says, go prepare a place so we can have the Pesach meal. Well, it's Aviv 14. The Pesach is the actual lamb is killed so there's evening, night, day. Evening is when the Pesach lamb is killed. They can't be celebrating with the eating of the lamb at that particular time yet, right? So it hasn't happened yet. So what is he doing? Well, he is celebrating the Pesach meal, because the meal takes place in evening. Oh, let me put it this way. Aviv 14 is not when you eat the Pesach lamb. It's when you kill the Pesach lamb. When do you kill the Pesach lamb? At the very end of the day, right before the day ends, you kill it, right? So it's just before twilight, you kill that lamb on Aviv 14. When do you eat it? Well, you can't get it into the house and eat it until the sun goes down. You're going to eat it on 15. The beginning of the day, which is in the evening on Aviv 15, you're going to be sitting down at the table. You're going to be eating the lamb with your family. So on this year, this happened on a Shabbat, on a Sabbath. This is what was a preparation day. So they're in the temple. They're killing the lambs. Yeshua is out on a cross. He's dying, right? His blood is being poured out. The high priests, they the priests, they send the guards to go break his legs because it's a preparation day. They have to hurry up because what? Well, they got to go home. It's a Sabbath, not only just a normal Sabbath, it's a special Sabbath because it happens to be the Hag Hamatzot and the day that there's going to be sitting down eating the lamb. And this is literally when he's taken to a grave. He's put in the grave. They all run home. They now would be eating the lamb and resting for Shabbat. So, did Jesus eat the Passover lamb? No, he was the Passover lamb. Why would he eat the Passover lamb? He was the Passover lamb. So what was he eating with his disciples? He was eating the Pesach meal, which is the meal that happens on Aviv 14. Why? Because Aviv 14 is not a, I guess we have to get this one thing understood. Pesach, Passover, not a festival. It is a lamb. The day that it dies is Pesach. When he says, I'm going to eat the Pesach meal, he's eating a meal on the day that a lamb dies. He dies. So he's eating his last meal on the day that the lambs die for Pesach. It just happens to be the night before because of the way they count time. So when he's eating that, it's still Hag Hamatzot. It's still, it has to be unleavened bread, which is what we see him do. So the night happens, the whole, arrest, trial, if you want to call it that. And then his murder and crucifixion happens exactly when the Passover lambs are killed. And they make note that it's right before sunset. And then, like I said, everybody goes home. So he's dead before sunset, before twilight. He dies when the lambs die. He's put into a grave. This is day one of him in the grave. Now we have to understand too that when we're counting, what is the Jewish reckoning for time as far as days go by? Is it, are we talking 72 hours he's got to be in the grave here? No. So there are different schools of thought on this. Some say, well, he mentions once it'll be like the sign of Jonah, how he was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, and so will the Son of Man be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. There are many ways to understand. There are several passages, first of all, where he mentions how he will be in the grave. There are ways to take that literally, that you have to do some gymnastics to make that work. Or you can understand that he's making a figurative point of speech here, which is what I think he's doing. It seems to be very clear that he's making a figurative point of speech. So why does this matter? If he dies on Aviv 14 with the Passover lambs, he's put into the grave before sunset. That's one day. He's in there on a day, then that day ends. Then it's Shabbat. He's in the grave in Sheol for an entire Shabbat. And then we have that day ends at sunset. The next day begins after sunset. So they call this the first day of the week. We'd call it Saturday night. At some point before dawn, he rises from the dead. Is it the moment the sun goes down? Is it just before the sun comes up? Don't really know. It doesn't say. But so did he rise from the dead Saturday night or Sunday morning? Don't know. But we know that he rose from the dead following Shabbat. And so I gave all the scriptures there so you can go look at all the scriptures. You can see that. The reason we're doing this, though, this is not something to build a theology on. This is not something for great debates and arguments. We're doing this for one reason, really, which is to help someone who's confused about the passages, who's confused about what is Passover, why did he die on this, what does that mean, how was he really the Passover lamb if he ate Passover? So that because there's confusion, because we use a different system of telling time, we want to just kind of give that clarification so that people understand how things actually went down. It's not because this is something that if you believe the right thing and you observe exactly the certain way of things, that it makes you more holy or more right, because it doesn't matter what you believe. It matters what you do with it. If he was our Passover lamb, then, and he was also the unleavened bread, you know, he's telling us to take it and eat, meaning to apply, to be covered in, to be clothed in Christ, to be clothed in what he did, as the Pesach lamb covers to protect from death. We put on Christ in that regard. We are protected from death because we walk in his ways. We walk in the newness of life provided by our Passover lamb, who was also the bread of life. We could talk about that forever.
Oh yeah, no, I think shedding light on the fact that this Passover meal, this Pesach meal, started on the 14th, and pointing out that you can't have the lamb at that point. That's really what helped me solidify everything in my mind of, okay, they're having this meal. It is on Pesach, the 14th.
Yep.
But they haven't even killed the lambs yet.
Right.
That makes so much more sense to me now, looking at it like that. And I love how it actually puts emphasis on exactly what Jesus actually talked about at the meal: the bread and the wine, his blood and his body,
Yep.
which is broken for us, right? And I think you almost risk losing the importance of that if you don't realize that that's what's going on there. If you're just focused on him being the Passover lamb, you can almost get sidetracked of, well, how's he fulfilling this? If he's eating the Passover meal, where's the lamb? Why doesn't he bring up the lamb?
Well,
And
we
that's some
also,
things that are
what is he getting ready
distracting.
to walk into? He's getting ready to be afflicted for our transgressions. What is matzah? It's a bread of affliction. I mean, this is a bread that you're not supposed to eat unless if you're remembering affliction or you're afflicted, right? And so what is he doing there? He's literally showing us. He's like, I'm the matzah. I am the bread of life. And I think for so long, there's nothing wrong with focusing on the Pesach in the sense of, how do I word this? Christians tend to fixate on the sacrificial death of the Messiah. You couldn't talk about it enough. So I'll just put it out there. You could always learn more. You could always understand deeper about what he did. But he did it for a reason. And what you'll often find within church, within Christianity, is that we sort of beat the drum over and over and over again. Jesus died for you. Jesus died for you. I don't think anybody doesn't know that. Maybe some people don't know that, but most people are aware at least of the concept. When he talks about being the bread of life, what does that mean? From him, we eat to live, right? From him is the fullness of life. All we need is from him. You start to learn a lot more about how you should be, not just what he did. When you think of him as the matzah, right? When you think of him as our bread of life. So I think that there's something to be said about that. Like I said, within Christianity, you'll see this with symbolism, throughout, not just basically I would say you see crosses everywhere, you see crucifixes, and within Catholicism, you see this deep focus on symbolism of the death of the Messiah. He's no longer on the cross. He's still the bread of life. And I think when we realize that we should move beyond just the milk of thinking about what he did and move to the meat about what that means we ought to be doing. You never lose sight of what he did, right? You always keep in your focus what he did. but that should then charge us with some action to go do something. He didn't, remember when he ascends, right? And we'll talk, maybe we'll talk about Shavuot or something next week, or I don't know what we'll get into, but when he ascends, and remember there's that scene, they're all sort of like looking at him and they're like watching him having ascended. Like, hey, what are you guys doing? He's going to come back the way he came. Remember how the angels show up to him and they're like, what are you waiting on? Go do it. Right. And, he leaves after he ascends, or as he's getting ready to ascend, he leaves with the Great Commission to go into all the world and make disciples, make students of the Word of God. So yes, it is good to be sober minded. It is good to be, it is good to remember, and that's what Pesach allows us the opportunity to do. But we should be remembering also that the Hag HaMatzot, like this is, what is the purpose of it, right? If like as Paul said, to get the leaven out. So what's the point here? To walk holy. What's holy? Not sinning. Well, what's sin? Transgression of God's commandments. So we should be remembering and focusing on the reality of the matzah, on the pure life, on the undefiled life, of the life where we walk righteously, upright before God, in light of our Passover lamb, or our Pesach lamb, who protected us from death. So I think that's something we should be thinking of and considering as we go through this time of year. I wanted to end with one quick thing, and then we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about, Brent. I know we got about 15 minutes left. And so I have this question, who is supposed to observe Pesach? And should as non-Jewish believers in Yeshua and Jesus, as in followers of Yeshua as our Messiah, should we be participating in the Pesach festival? First, I want to say one thing. There is no more lamb necessary. The sacrificial system, in order to atone for sins, is gone. It was the Torah is not nailed to the cross. The sacrificial system is. So should we be having a Pesach lamb every year? Nope, don't need it. You don't even need a bone. You don't need any meat. Don't need it. He died. That's it. The penalty has for sin, for transgression, has been paid, so long as we apply the blood of the Messiah to our lives. So there's no more need for that sacrificial system. It's gone. He died once and for all, as Paul puts it. So what is the purpose of remembering this week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, matzah, and the Pesach meal? Well, we do it in honor of what he did. So what do we celebrate when we celebrate Pesach? We celebrate the life that he gave and the death that he died for the life that he gave us. The protection from death that he brought us. He brought us out of Egypt, out of sin and slavery, right? And so that's what we're celebrating whenever we remember him. And as often as we do this, we do it in remembrance of him and his death until he comes. But there's also a beautiful passage here in 1 Corinthians, we read it a minute ago, 5, 6 through 8. It says, your boasting is not good. He's Paul talking to the Corinthians, to the believers in Corinth. He's kind of giving a pretty harsh critique here. Your boasting is not good. You know that a little chametz or leaven spreads to the whole mixture. Therefore, cleanse out, right? So we read this just a minute ago. Therefore, cleanse out the old chametz, the old leaven, so that you may be a new dough, as you are matzah. It's very interesting that Paul is now calling us matzah. Remember, because Yeshua, Christ, he says he's the bread of life. He's the matzah. He's the pure, undefiled bread. There's no leaven in him. Now we are, because of Christ. For Yeshua, our Pesach lamb has been sacrificed. Why are we the matzah? Because Yeshua, our Pesach lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the feast. We're celebrating it, not with the old chametz, that is of wickedness and dysfunction or evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So, should we celebrate the feast? According to Paul, yeah. As long as we're doing it the right way, absolutely. And again in 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 26. For I received from the Lord what what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Yeshua, on the night that he was betrayed, took the matzah, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took up the cup. He took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the renewed covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you do, or as often as you drink it, in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So, should we be doing this? Is it replaced by some little wafers and grape juice at a weekly service? No, no. If you want to have matzah and wine or whatever you want to drink, is fine. If you want to have that every week, and you have a sort of a communion, go for it. But it doesn't replace the feast that God gave us. This feast that the Messiah celebrated, that Paul celebrated and commended us to celebrate. This is all going to foreshadow the redemption that will come when we are taken out of this world later. So this is all like God's timing things.
I would actually like to discuss with you this week what you think just about the next episode and stuff like that. Because I know that we were heading into some really, really interesting territory next. I think one thing that I think I might have even said it last episode, but it was kind of refreshed yesterday whenever we taught our youth group. You've brought up that last bit there about, are we required, basically, should we keep the festival, right? I think we should. It's very, like you just laid out, Paul's of the mindset that we're going to continue it.
There is one thing I want to interject real quick there, because there was one commandment that God gave about foreigners, right? Meaning a non-Jew who celebrates, that they must be circumcised. Now, don't get your knives out. What is true circumcision? That of the heart. So before you sit down and you partake in the Pesach, your heart must be circumcised. If your heart is circumcised, you are free to eat it. Continue.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's what I pointed out to the youth group yesterday, is that we might not be required the way some people would see it as accomplish this work for salvation or whatever like that.
Yeah, it's not a salvation.
We are not. Yeah, we're not required to do this, but it is interesting whenever you look at why they were told to do it. So they never forgot, right? When your children ask you, tell them this is why we do this. He says that about every single festival.
Let me ask you one question.
And so
about
it's
that.
go ahead.
I want to ask you a question about that, because are we grafted in as full citizens of Israel?
Yes.
Are they required to do it so that they remember? Is it a salvation thing? No, none of the Torah is. You're not going to be saved by doing any of it. You could do all of it perfectly. Doesn't make you saved. It does not make you saved by keeping it. However, God says to do these things. Why? Why if it's not about being saved, why do we do it? Well, not everything that God tells you to do is about being saved. It's about our righteousness, our right standing with God. He says, I have joined you to my people. You are now Israel, full rights as citizens. Right? We see this in the New Testament. We are grafted in. We have all the rights as citizens of Israel. With those rights come responsibilities. God says that all of Israel, anyone, even the sojourners amongst them, anyone who joins themselves, he literally says, anyone who joins themselves to you, they must do this. Now, doing it doesn't make you saved. Not doing it, is it a disobedience? I would say yeah. So it's not. I don't find it as again. It's not like if I keep Sabbath, if I do the Pesach meal, if I keep the week of matzah, unleavened bread, if I do those things, it makes me righteous, but absolutely not. It adds not 1 ounce of salvation to me. Why? Because I'm redeemed by what he did. My salvation is through his blood. It's through his mercy. It is through unmerited grace and mercy from God. But keeping it as commanded by God, well, what does that do? Well, it keeps me in time with him. It keeps me remembering things the way that he wants us to remember. He's cyclical, but he's also grafted us into the people of Israel. He commanded them to do it. No different than he commanded them not to murder. I look at it the same way. God says, don't murder, Israel. Okay, well, I can't murder either. Israel, remember the Pesach. Remember the Hag Hamatzot. Remember it. Do it every year. It's not like, Israel, if you do that, you'll be saved. It's like, Israel, do that, because that's what I want you to be doing every year. So that's the way I look at it. I don't look at it as it's never a salvation issue. But Christians look at it as salvation issue. If it's not, therefore it's unimportant. It's sort of, if I feel like it. I don't think biblically that's how God's looking at it. It's not, well, if it's not salvation, it doesn't reach the threshold of it's important and I must do it. That's not how he looks at things. So salvation was gracious redemption, keeping his promise. The commandments are unrelated things that he tells you to do. You know what I mean? So I don't want to make people feel like if you don't do this, you're not saved. I would never say that. I don't believe that. If you are grafted into the people of Israel, should you be doing it? Yeah, I would say it's not just a benefit. I think you should do it. The same way as I think you should walk upright in everything that you do. Paul clearly says, as we read it, Paul's like, in that 1 Corinthians 5, let us therefore celebrate the feast. But how? Right? Not with leaven, wickedness and evil, but with the matzah, the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth, with Christ, right? So how are we? It's how we're doing these things. We're remembering what He's done. So I think that it's very important to make that distinction. That it's not a you must or you're going to hell or if you don't or if you do it you're saved by doing it. None of that is even in the conversation. But it is a righteousness issue, right? Because God commanded it, and we've been grafted in. Why is it important? Because we're remembering His death until He comes. It's not something that anybody should have to say you have to do it. It's something that people say you get to do it. We get to do this. We get to be reminded once a year to take a time of solemn remembrance of what He did, and then what that should encourage us to be doing throughout our year. So it is a get to, not a have to. But so I just want to clarify that a little bit. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, no. I like to look at it. You look at why Israel was told to do it, and it's so they wouldn't forget. It's so they would always remember, but also so they would be looking forward to what the Messiah would look like, right?
Yep.
So many of these festivals are built around their fulfillment in the Messiah. As you look at over 2,000 years, I think, where they celebrated all these things, it's so interesting that this is how Israel was so special to God, right? He says, I didn't choose you because you were a great people. I chose you because you weren't a people. I made you, right? You are my portion. I will guide you, lead you. I'll bring about my Messiah through you.
Yep.
So over these 2,000 years where they're celebrating all these feasts and festivals and remembering Him, they are constantly building their relationship with God, who chose them as His people. They're constantly learning more about God. We've done 3 episodes here on one festival. We could do many more, and I'm actually going to try to talk you into doing one more, but that's besides the point. But you look at all this stuff that you get to learn. That's what they did for over 2,000 years. And so now to be grafted in, as we said, right, as Paul puts it in Romans, but not just grafted in, we are invited now to what? To get to know God. We're invited through these festivals to get to know Yeshua, our Messiah. what he did, different aspects, how it pertains to us. It's so hard to overstate the importance of just getting to know him, getting the leaven out of your life. Why is he the bread? Why is he the lamb? What did it do? All of this stuff is so important because, and like Paul says, don't let anyone look down on you for a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath, anything like that.
Absolutely.
Don't look down on you. But once you know this information,
Yep.
like you said in the very beginning, what do you do with it?
Yeah.
Once you know that they observed this, that they celebrated this, what's the reason not to?
Yep.
The
Absolutely.
benefit far outweighs not doing it.
Absolutely. And I feel like that's such a strange stance that we've taken as Christians for so long, which is, do I have to? Because we're always measuring everything whether or not it has salvation implications. If I don't have to, then I won't. Well, is that the healthiest way to look at things? Imagine you had your children, right? You've got 5 kids. I've got 3. I'm sure people out there listening have kids. Imagine if every time you said to your kid, you're like, hey, I want you to do this thing. I've got this thing for you to do. And it's, for us to do together. And the kid's like, if I don't do it, will you kill me and send me away? Or will you cut me off? Or will you, if I don't do it, will you disown me? It's a weird way to look at a relationship with a father, a parent. Every time he's offering us this opportunity to get closer, we're like, if I don't do this, does it mean like eternally I'm not good? That's not no way to have a relationship. And he's not offering it to, again, it's not like God is saying, if you don't do this, I'm going to damn you to hell forever. That's not what he's saying, right? But think about, if you didn't, prior to Christ, if you didn't put the blood of the Passover lamb on your door in Egypt, you were cut off. If you didn't celebrate the Pesach, like if you just, no, I'm not doing it, no interest, you weren't a part of it. You weren't a part of it, right? If you don't apply the blood of the Messiah to your life, if you don't put on Christ, if he's not protecting you from death, you don't have protection from death. I mean, you're going to die, spiritually speaking. So when we celebrate this, it's to remind ourselves, because we're a forgetful species. We forget things. And it's to remind ourselves, hey, I am clothed in the blood of the Messiah. How ought I to be thinking and living and acting and behaving? And this is a cyclical reminder. And again, we got to stop looking at things as Christians as salvation issues all the time. Just walk upright before God and do the things he asks you to do and see how it turns out, and I guarantee one thing. I guarantee that you, and if you have children and your children, if you're in a community, people, your whole community, they will benefit from it. You will see the blessing from it. I guarantee it. You grow so much together when you start to come together and collectively remembering and sharing and thinking about these things.
The fact that we go back to this thing of, am I required to do it or not? And it's like, no, you get to. Do you realize for over 2,000 years, we didn't get to?
Yeah.
Gentiles didn't get to. You could join the Israelites through a whole process, right?
Yeah.
But you didn't
It's
get
pretty painful
this.
for you and I.
Our families didn't have this. Yeah. Our families didn't have this. Your generations weren't blessed by these teachings, these festivals, knowing what God did, knowing what he's going to do. It blows my mind how we treat it sometimes as Christians.
Yeah. But next week we will pick up from where we're leaving off. We'll do one more week.
That means one more episode of Passover. So I was going to poke Danny into it anyway. So this will be perfect.
Yeah, we'll do one more episode. Maybe we'll give some of those nuggets, little things you've been talking about.
No, that sounds great, man. I look forward to it, and you should close this out in prayer.
All right. You want me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for all you've done, for teaching us your ways. We ask, God, that you continuously remind us of your goodness, of who you are and what you've done for us and what you expect from us. Help us to walk in your ways and to honor you in all that we do. In the name of Yeshua, I'll say the blessing. Yevarechecha Yehovah va'ishmerecha. Ya'ir Yehovah panav elecha ve'honecha. Yisa Yehovah panav elecha va'yasim lecha shalom. B'Hashem Yeshua HaMashiach. Amen. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and give you his shalom. In the name of Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.